In the bitter aftermath of the First World War, Europe did not simply redraw borders, it fractured identities. Empires collapsed, currencies failed, and entire populations found themselves stranded on the wrong side of new lines inked onto maps in distant capitals. In the Sudetenland, ethnic Germans who had once belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire now lived inside the young state of Czechoslovakia. Among them was a quiet bookstore clerk named Karl Hermann Frank. At first glance, he was unremarkable. But resentments, when cultivated patiently, can become something far more dangerous, and Frank was listening. The treaty settlement that followed the war was hailed internationally as peace. Yet for many Sudeten Germans, it felt like dispossession. The language of grievance hardened into political identity. Frank absorbed it. He read nationalist literature. He spoke of betrayal. He nurtured a belief that history had wronged his people and that history would one day be corrected. Correction came in the form of a rising political force across the German border. When Adolf Hitler seized power in 1933, his rhetoric of restoration echoed powerfully among Sudeten Germans. He promised unity, he promised pride, he promised that Germans would never again bow to humiliation. For Frank, these promises were not abstract, they were personal. By 1938, Europe stood on edge. The Sudetenland crisis escalated from diplomatic tension to imminent confrontation. Hitler demanded the annexation of the German-speaking borderlands of Czechoslovakia. International negotiations faltered, troops mobilized. And when the Sudetenland was ceded to Germany following the Munich Agreement, local nationalist figures suddenly found themselves elevated. Frank's years of agitation paid off. He was appointed deputy Gauleiter and quickly became one of Berlin's most reliable men in the region. But what did he intend to do with this sudden authority? The answer emerged swiftly. In March 1939, Germany dismantled what remained of Czechoslovakia and established the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. It was presented as administrative necessity order imposed upon instability. In reality, it was occupation. Frank's influence deepened. He became state secretary under the Reich protector, embedding himself in the governing structure. From his office in Prague, he helped transform ideology into policy. Surveillance networks expanded. Political opponents were arrested. Czech institutions were subordinated to German oversight. The machinery of repression did not roar into life all at once, it clicked into place methodically, file by file, decree by decree. Frank proved adept not on battlefields, but in bureaucracies. He understood that fear could be organized. By 1943, he rose to the position of German Minister of State for Bohemia and Moravia, consolidating authority over civil administration and security. Under his watch, prisons filled, resistance suspects disappeared. The atmosphere thickened with suspicion, yet to outward observers, governance appeared orderly, efficient, even. That was the genius of bureaucratic terror. It wore the mask of administration. And still a greater test of his power loomed. In Prague, resentment did not vanish under repression, it adapted. Underground resistance networks formed quietly, waiting for opportunity. They would strike not at a minor official, but at one of the Reich's most feared architects. When that blow landed in May 1942, it would shatter the fragile illusion of control and reveal just how far Frank was willing to go. Before we step into that decisive moment, take a second to support this channel. Subscribe and like the video because telling these stories ensures that the mechanisms of power and terror are not forgotten, and it helps more people discover the history that shaped our world. The coming retaliation would not be measured, it would not be proportional. It would be designed to terrify an entire nation into silence. And once unleashed, it would stain Frank's name permanently into history. On the morning of May 27, 1942, Prague felt tense but orderly. Trams rattled along their routes, office clerks hurried through cobbled streets. Then, at a sharp bend in the road, in the district of Lidice, a car carrying one of the most powerful men in Nazi-occupied Europe slowed down. History detonated. Resistance fighters attacked Reinhard Heydrich, the acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, bullets were fired, a bomb exploded. Smoke filled the air, Heydrich was gravely wounded. And in that suspended moment between attack and consequence, no one yet understood how catastrophic the retaliation would be. Heydrich lingered for days before succumbing to his injuries on June 4, 1942. His death enraged Berlin. He had been one of the architects of the regime's most brutal policies, a man of cold precision and immense influence. His assassination was not merely an attack, it was an insult to Nazi authority. The demand from above was unmistakable. The response must be devastating. In the Protectorate, responsibility fell heavily upon Karl Hermann Frank. He convened security officials. He drafted measures. He did not counsel restraint. Instead, he argued that the Czech population must be taught a lesson so severe that resistance would wither under fear. The question was not whether to retaliate, but how spectacularly. The answer came swiftly. The village of Lidice, northwest of Prague, was accused falsely of aiding the assassins. Evidence was thin. That did not matter. Lidice would become a symbol. On June 10, 1942, German forces surrounded the village. Men over the age of 15 were separated from their families and lined against barn walls. Execution squads fired in methodical rotations. The shots echoed through fields that had known only harvest and him. Women were deported to concentration camps. Children were taken from their mothers, some selected for Germanization, others murdered in extermination facilities. And as buildings were dynamited and set ablaze, Frank personally oversaw the operation's thoroughness. Lidice was not merely punished, it was erased. But if one village could vanish overnight, what would stop another? The destruction did not end there. 2 weeks later, the village of Ležáky suffered a similar fate after being linked to resistance radio transmissions. Its inhabitants were executed or deported, homes were razed. The landscape was altered deliberately so that maps would no longer bear the name. The intention was psychological warfare, obliteration as warning. Under Frank's administration, arrests multiplied across the Protectorate. Thousands were interrogated, imprisoned, or executed. Curfews tightened, informants flourished. Whispers became treasonous risks, the atmosphere thickened with dread. For a time, terror achieved its objective, resistance activity diminished. Silence settled like a heavy fog over Czech society. Meanwhile, Frank lived in confiscated residences, surrounded by the privileges of occupation. He spoke confidently of order restored. Reports flowed across his desk documenting detentions and deportations. Each signature extended the reach of fear. He believed the lesson of Lidice had secured obedience. But history rarely freezes at the moment of dominance. Beyond the Protectorate's borders, the war was turning. German armies were bleeding on distant fronts. Allied forces were gaining momentum. What had seemed unshakable in 1940 began to look fragile by 1943 and 1944. The machinery of repression continued to grind, but the ground beneath it was shifting. Frank had built authority through intimidation, convinced that terror could cement permanence. Yet regimes sustained by fear often overlook one truth. When the tide reverses, the instruments of terror become evidence. By early 1945, that reversal was no longer theoretical. And the administrator who once ordered villages erased would soon confront a reality he had never anticipated, one in which there would be nowhere left to hide. By the spring of 1945, the world that Karl Hermann Frank had helped construct was collapsing with astonishing speed. The illusion of permanence so carefully cultivated through decrees, prisons, and firing squads was dissolving under artillery fire and advancing armies. Across Europe, the Third Reich was fragmenting. And in Prague, the tremors of its final days could be felt in every corridor of power. For a man who had ruled through intimidation, the sudden silence of obedience carried a different sound now and certainty. The Red Army pushed steadily westward. German defenses crumbled under relentless assault. Cities once draped in swastika banners prepared for siege or surrender. In the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, tension ripened into defiance. Czech resistance groups sensed the shift. whispers turned into planning. And as news of Germany's mounting defeats spread, the fear that had once paralyzed the population began to loosen its grip. The question was no longer whether the Reich would endure, but how violently it would fall. In early May 1945, Prague erupted. Barricades rose in the streets. Czech partisans seized radio stations and government buildings. German authority fractured almost overnight. For years, Frank had presided over a system of surveillance and repression. Now that system was buckling under chaos. The uprising was not merely military, it was symbolic. The city that had lived under terror was reclaiming its voice. And in that roar of defiance lay a silent reckoning. Frank understood what was coming. He attempted to maintain order, issuing commands to suppress the rebellion. But orders require loyal structures to carry them out, and those structures were disintegrating. German forces were retreating westward, desperate to surrender to American rather than Soviet troops. The carefully administered machinery of occupation was collapsing into confusion. And in the midst of that unraveling, Frank made a decision that revealed the depth of his desperation. He fled. Gone was the confident minister issuing decrees from Prague Castle. In his place was a man seeking anonymity. Disguised in military attire, carrying false documents, he moved westward with retreating German units, hoping to blend into the chaos of defeat. The transformation was stark, from architect of annihilation to fugitive in flight. But could a man whose name was etched into the memory of a nation truly disappear? He could not. Near the city of Pilsen, American forces intercepted him. The disguise failed, the papers were examined. His identity was confirmed. The administrator of Lidice, the overseer of repression, was now a prisoner. There were no offices left to command, no police units to shield him, no decrees to issue. What remained were documents, testimonies, and the unburied memory of villages destroyed. Extradition followed. Frank was handed over to Czechoslovak authorities. The nation he had governed through fear would now judge him. Crowds gathered when news of his capture spread. For many Czechs, this was not simply the detention of a former official, it was the physical embodiment of years of suffering placed behind bars. And as preparations for trial began, a new atmosphere replaced the old one. Not terror, not silence. Anticipation. Before we step into that courtroom, take a moment to subscribe and like this video. Supporting this channel ensures that these histories, complex, painful, and necessary, reach more people. The story of bureaucratic terror is not just about the past, it's a warning etched into modern memory. Frank had once believed that authority insulated him from consequence, that the destruction of Lidice and Ležáky would secure obedience indefinitely. Now he stood at the threshold of judgment, stripped of rank and illusion. And in Prague, justice was preparing its final act. In May 1946, less than a year after the collapse of the Third Reich, Karl Hermann Frank stood not behind a minister's desk, but inside a courtroom in Prague. The setting was formal, almost restrained wooden benches, judicial robes, a structured proceeding. Yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere pulsed with accumulated memory. This was not merely a trial of an individual. It was a reckoning with a system of terror that had worn the mask of administration. The charges were clear: responsibility for mass executions, deportations, and the annihilation of villages, most notoriously Lidice and Ležáky. Prosecutors laid out the documentation with chilling precision. Orders signed, reports filed, testimonies gathered. The defense could not argue battlefield confusion or spontaneous violence. This was something else. It was governance weaponized. The trial lasted only for days. Witnesses described the arrests that came at night, the disappearances, the methodical execution of men lined against walls, the deportation of women and children whose names had once filled village registers. Frank, who had once spoken with authority about order and discipline, now answered questions under scrutiny. He attempted to portray himself as a subordinate carrying out directives. But evidence showed active involvement, supervision, insistence, escalation. He had not been a passive conduit of terror. He had shaped its intensity. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered daily. The Czech public did not see this as vengeance. It was something more deliberate, justice articulated through law. For 6 years, fear had governed public life. Now procedure governed accountability. The transformation was profound. A regime that had relied on intimidation and spectacle would see one of its chief administrators judged through legal process. And as the verdict approached, tension mounted not because the outcome was uncertain, but because history was about to close a chapter. On May 24, 1946, the sentence was carried out at Prague's Pankráč prison. Thousands assembled outside. It was a public execution, not in celebration, but in solemn acknowledgement. The men who had overseen obliteration stood beneath a rope. There were no grand speeches, no uniformed authority. Only the weight of judgment rendered by a nation he had once sought to break. The execution lasted 20 minutes. For those who had survived occupation, the moment symbolized more than the end of one life. It represented the collapse of a system built on fear. Frank's trajectory mirrored that of the regime he served, grievance nurtured into ideology, ideology empowered into administration, administration hardened into cruelty, and cruelty finally confronted by consequence. History does not remember him for titles. It remembers him for the villages erased, for the families shattered, for the bureaucratic signatures that translated hatred into action. The story of Karl Hermann Frank is not one of battlefield drama or strategic brilliance. It is a study in how terror can be organized quietly, efficiently, behind office doors. It is a reminder that cruelty often arrives stamped and filed. When the war ended, armies celebrated victory. But in Prague, justice also advanced measured, deliberate, and unflinching. Beneath a spring sky in 1946, the arc of Frank's power reached its conclusion not in ceremony, but in accountability. And the lesson endures. Regimes built on fear may rise swiftly, but they write their own verdicts.